There are certain figures in culture and in music specifically who feel less like actual people and more like, like monuments.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like they're these stoic, immovable statues. You look at them and they're always wearing the exact same expression. Or, well, in the case of the artist we are diving into today, the same pair of dark sunglasses, basically hiding whatever's going on behind them.
Right, the classic man behind the mask.
Exactly, the man in the mask. We are talking about Matti Caspi today. And if you are familiar with Israeli music, or honestly, if you just study music history and global composition, that name carries a massive amount of weight.
Oh, absolutely.
He is a musical, and I really don't use that word lightly, but he is also a complete enigma. He is famous for never smiling. He's famous for this incredibly dry, robotic public persona.
People used to call him the Buster Keaton of music. Just this total stone face no matter what was happening around.
Buster Keaton, yeah, that is spot on. But here is where it gets really interesting. And this is exactly why we are doing this deep dive for you today. We aren't just looking at his greatest hits or doing a standard biography. We are looking at a specific, very recent, and honestly incredibly heavy document.
It's a tough read.
It really is. It's a transcript of what the source material calls his last and special interview, which was conducted by Roni Kuban.
And I think it's important to clarify right up front that the word last in this context, it isn't some clever marketing gimmick.
No.
It's a medical reality. It's a diagnosis.
Yeah. We are dealing with a man who has spent literally his entire life building this impenetrable wall of silence around his emotion. A guy who only ever communicated his feelings through these incredibly complex harmonies and melodies. But now he is facing stage 4 cancer. He is facing the end. And for the very first time, we're seeing that wall come down.
It is a totally fascinating, albeit really tragic, setup for a conversation. You have this architecture of political silence, which is a phrase from the sources we will definitely unpack later, where he just fundamentally refused to engage with the noise of the outside world. And now, forced by biology, by his own mortality, he is finally speaking.
So our mission today isn't just to talk about the songs. I mean, we have to talk about the music because the songs explain the man. But the real goal here is to figure out the architecture of that wall. Mm-hmm. How did a lonely boy from a strict kibbutz become this unparalleled architect of a totally new musical language?
Then how he shut the world out to do it.
Right. And then how, right at the finish line, he is somehow figuring out how to let the world back in. It's really the story of a man learning how to love right as he's preparing to say goodbye.
It really is. And I think we should just dive right into the deep end here, starting with the interview itself.
Let's do it.
So this conversation with Roni Kuban was recorded roughly 2 months after Caspi got. And usually, when you hear a rock star interview, you expect a certain level of swagger or maybe a polished redemption. But this transcript starts with something so visceral. It starts with his voice.
Or I guess the lack of his voice.
Yeah. Matti Caspi's singing voice is iconic. It's this incredibly deep, resonant baritone. It anchors everything he does. But right away in this interview, he admits that it is failing. He actually says he is checking how low I can.
That specific phrase really stuck with me when I was reading the source text, checking how low I can go. Because on one level, it's just a musician's technical observation, right? He's monitoring his pitch, his vocal cords.
Sure, it's analytical.
But in the context of a terminal stage 4 diagnosis, it feels so dark. It's almost like he is charting his own physical decline in real time. He tells the interviewer that he has completely stopped singing, just stopped.
Which is devastating.
Right. For a man whose entire existence, his whole identity is defined by making sound, that silence has to be totally deafening.
It's essentially an amputation of his identity. You really have to understand, for someone like Caspi, singing and composing isn't just a career. It's the primary and maybe the only way he actually interacts with reality.
Yeah.
And he mentions that cancer is stage 4, but what's wild is that when Kuban presses him on the details, asking what kind of cancer, where exactly is it, Caspi is totally dismissive. He says he doesn't even know, or that it just doesn't matter. It's just stage 4.
Which brings us to his actual reaction to the news. And this is where the legend of the stone face really gets tested. Because let's be honest, if I were sitting in a doctor's office and was told I had stage 4 cancer, I would be an absolute mess. I would be panicking.
I think most people would. It is the ultimate...
But he says, and I quote, I wasn't startled. He says he didn't flinch at all. He literally calls it his poker face.
Which is entirely consistent with his public persona for the last 50 years, isn't it? But it really forces you to ask a question. Is that reaction true bravery, or is it a psychological defense mechanism that has just been calcified over 70 years?
Right.
Because he tells Kuban explicitly that he isn't afraid of death. He says it's a human trait, not today. Basically, his logic is, everyone dies eventually, so why waste time panicking about it?
It's so hyperlogical that it almost sounds inhuman. But as you read further into the transcript, you see this crack in the armor. He is not afraid of the end itself, but he is absolutely terrified of the process.
That physical pain?
Exactly, the pain. He describes the physical pain as being immense.
Yeah.
He says it is so loud and so overwhelming that it overshadows the question of fear entirely.
That is such a profound insight into chronic. We have a tendency in culture to romanticize the end of life, peaceful time of flexion and tying. But Caspi is bluntly saying, I am simply too busy hurting to be scared. The pain takes up all the mental bandwidth. It silences the philosophical dread because the physical reality is just screaming.
And yet, amidst all of that screaming pain, something else is happening, something he completely failed to account for in his hyperlogical world. He admits to Kuban that he is actually surprised by the reaction he is getting from the world.
The outpouring of love.
The love, yeah. He says he is getting lots and lots of love from friends, from the general public. And when you read the transcript, you really get the sense that he is genuinely baffled.
Which is heartbreaking in its own weird way. I mean, why should a national cultural treasure be surprised that people actually love him?
That's exactly what I thought.
But you have to try and look at it from his perspective. He spent decades aggressively projecting distance. He didn't play the celebrity game. He didn't smile for the cameras or do the warm and fuzzy talk show circuit. He was the ultimate loner.
Yeah. Strictly business.
Right. So his internal calculation was likely something along the lines of, I give them the music, they buy the record, the transaction. I think he fundamentally didn't realize that by bearing his soul in the music, he was creating a deeply emotional, even if he thought it only went one way. Now that he is vulnerable, all that connection is rushing back at him like a tidal wave.
He actually calls love the only thing that remains steadfast, which is a huge paradigm shift for him. It feels like maybe for the first time in his life, he is finally allowing himself to be the recipient of emotion, not just the broadcast.
It is the difference between being admired from afar and being truly held. And to understand why he has such a hard time being held, whether we mean that metaphorically or physically, we really have to rewind the tape here. We have to go all the way back to his source code.
We have to go to the kibbutz.
Specifically, Kibbutz Hanit.
Now, for you listening who might just picture a nice, idyllic community farm when you hear the word kibbutz, we need to clarify the era we are talking about. This is the 1950s. This isn't a modern eco-village or a vacation spot. This is a radical, highly structured ideological experiment.
It is a collective society in the truest, strictest sense. The individual is entirely secondary to the group. You work for the group, you eat with the group in a communal dining hall, and crucially, your children are largely raised by them.
And into this rigid system, Matti Caspi is born. And straight away, right from the jump, you can see he does not fit the mold. There is this incredible story in the sources about his first instrument. And it wasn't a piano, right?
No, definitely not a piano. Pianos are expensive, and they take up space, and they imply a certain level of bourgeois individual. His first instrument was a recorder. Simple, mass. He says he found it sitting on his pillow when he was in the first grade. It was a standard gift distributed equally to all the children his age.
Perfect kibbutz equality. Everyone gets a flute, no one gets left out, no one gets a hand.
Exact. But while the other kids were probably using their recorders as swords to hit each other or just making terrible high-pitched squeaks, Matti was entirely different. He says he had maybe 2 basic lessons, but he intuitively grasped the fundamental principle of the instrument almost immediately.
You just got it.
He figured out the physics of it. You cover these holes, it changes the column of air, it changes the pitch.
And typical Matti, even at that age, he immediately demands to perform for people. He is in the first grade. I could just imagine the teacher saying, "Kid, you are on page 2 of the instructional workbook. Please sit down."
But he absolutely insisted. And so he performed a traditional Hanukkah song, Who Made Me a Latke.
And this next detail, this is where the genius label really starts to make tangible. He says he actually got bored during his own performance.
Bored in the middle of his very first debut.
So what does he do? He starts humming. But he is not just humming the melody that he is playing on the flute. He starts humming a second, completely different harmony line with his voice while his fingers are playing the main melody on the recorder.
Let's just pause and appreciate the sheer cognitive processing power required for that. In music theory, we call that polyphony, generating multiple independent voices simultaneously. For a fully trained adult musician, singing one counter line while playing a different primary line is difficult. It requires intentionally splitting your brain's focus.
Yeah, it's like rubbing your stomach and patting your head, but with musical notes.
Exactly. For a 6-year-old child to do it spontaneously, simply because the main melody was too simple and his brain was bored, that is a freakish 1 in a million level of raw talent.
It's like his brain was starving for a level of complexity that his environment just wasn't providing. But then, inevitably, he runs headfirst into the ideological wall of the kibbutz. Yeah. Because he realizes the recorder isn't enough. He wants a piano.
Right. The famous piano war.
He asks his parents for piano lessons. His parents then have to go and ask the kibbutz leadership, and the answer is a flat no.
And the reasoning provided is pure, unadulterated socialism. The committee tells them, we are a cooperative group. If one child learns the piano, then everyone deserves to learn the piano. We simply cannot afford to buy pianos for everyone, therefore, no one gets one.
It's that classic logic. If everyone can't have it, no one can. It is explicitly designed to prevent elitism and inequality, but in this specific case, it was actively suppressing a prodigy.
It is the tall poppy syndrome codified into community law. But Matti's father, and this is a really interesting character detail in the source material, his father wasn't a musician himself. But he clearly recognized something extraordinary in his son, because he actually went to war for that piano.
Caspi describes it as a relentless battle against the kibbutz, the culture committee, the social committee, the farm committee. It sounds utterly exhausting.
It took 2 full years, 2 years of endless bureaucratic fighting, arguing with your own neighbors at every community meeting, just to get a young child some music lessons.
But they won. Eventually, they wore them down.
They did. But think about the psychological lesson that teaches a formative child. It teaches him my natural state, my deep desire to create, is inherently a problem for the group. I have to fight tooth and nail just to be allowed to be myself. It massively reinforces that feeling of...
And it wasn't just the music struggle that made him feel isolated. The interview gets incredibly raw when he talks about his parents and their approach to affection. He uses a phrase that really hit me hard. He says, they thought they loved.
It is such a devastating distinction to make. They thought they loved. He's not saying they were actively malicious or physically abusive. He says they just followed the book.
The communal manual on child rearing.
Right. Feed the children exactly on time. Check. Take them for a scheduled walk to get fresh air. Check. Sit them down to listen to the educational programs on the radio. Check. They function perfectly as characters. But he says the one vital thing missing was touch.
No hugging. No caressing.
None. He describes it as a massive void, a total comprehensive lack of physical intimacy. And he stresses that this is a developmental deficit that lasts a life.
It explains so much about the man we see later in life. The dark sunglasses, the completely frozen face. If you aren't touched as a child, if you aren't held when you cry, you learn to retreat entirely into yourself. You build a shell.
You build a fortress. And for Caspi, music essentially became the furniture inside that. He says that music and nature were his only refuge. He actually had to learn to self-soothe through making sound because he couldn't get that soothing from a...
So that piano he fought so hard for, it wasn't just an instrument to him. It was literally a substitute for a hug.
In many ways, yeah. It was the only safe space where he could express the complex things he wasn't allowed to feel or simply didn't have the vocabulary to say within the collective.
So this strange, lonely, intensely brilliant kid grows up. And in Israel, growing up generally means one very specific thing, the army.
The great equalizer.
But for Matti, it was also the great accelerator. He joins the Southern Command Troop. Now, could you explain the troops for listeners who might just picture a standard military marching band?
Oh, it is nothing like a marching band. The army troops in Israel, especially during that specific era, were essentially the country's pop star facts. They weren't just playing marching music for parades. They were full entertainment units that put on elaborate skits, comedy routines, and pop concerts for the enlisted soldiers.
So it was a big deal.
A huge deal. Being accepted into a prominent troop was kind of like getting accepted into Juilliard and being cast on American Idol at the exact same time. Yeah. It was the undisputed gateway to the commercial.
And Matti didn't just join the troop. He completely dominated, but he did it quietly. He wasn't the charismatic guy jumping around at the front of the stage initially.
No, he was in the back, but he was writing. And that was highly unusual. Usually, these young soldiers perform songs that were written by the grown-up, established, famous composers of the day. But Matti, who is still just a kid in a uniform, writes an original song called Ani Met, which translates to, I'm dying to touch the night.
And it becomes a massive hit.
A nationwide chart topper. That is the ultimate signal flare in that when an unknown soldier writes a #1 hit, the entire music business wakes up, pays attention.
But here is the funny thing about all of this. Even with a hit song, Matti still didn't really think of himself as a singer. He thought of himself strictly as a musician, a composer behind the scenes. The fact that he became a famous vocalist was almost a complete accident.
A very happy accident that involves a true legend. We definitely have to talk about the Eric Einstein story.
Please do. For context, for those who don't know, who exactly is Eric Einstein?
Okay, if we are trying to use American cultural analogies, imagine if Frank Sinatra and Bob Dylan had a baby, and that baby grew up to be the coolest, most universally beloved guy in the entire country. That is Eric Einstein. He is literally the voice of Israel, the absolute godfather of Israeli rock and pop.
So young Matti Caspi, this terrified, awkward soul, goes to Eric Einstein's actual house to pitch him a song.
Just imagine the sheer nerves. You are standing on the front doorstep of a living god. Caspi says he was literally shaken. But he goes in, he sits down at Einstein's piano, and he plays the song. And he sings the lyrics just to demonstrate how the vocal melody go.
And Einstein just sits there and listens.
Da-da-da.
And then he says the one sentence that completely changes the trajectory of Matti's.
He looks at him and says, "You can sing this better than I can."
Wow.
I mean, just think about the weight of that validation. This isn't your mom telling you that you have a nice singing voice. This is Eric Einstein telling you that you just beat him at his own game on your own song.
Caspi says he floated all the way home that day.
That was the ultimate permission slip. He realized, well, okay, if Eric Einstein says I am a singer, then I guess I have to be a singer.
But he also bluffed his way into several other major roles in the industry. The story in the source is about Yossi Benai, who is another massive cultural legend, a pure comedy.
Yeah.
Benai asks him, who do you want to arrange this song?
Right. And arranging is a highly technical skill. It is deciding exactly what the violins do, what the drums do, writing out the specific sheet music for every single... Matti had never actually done it before in his life.
But he just looks at Benai and says, me.
Pure, or honestly, maybe just blind panic.
So he actually gets the gig. He calls up a producer named Rachel, and she asks him what instruments he needs to book for the studio session. And he just starts ordering off a menu he has never even read.
He says, give me a bass, drums, a piano, a flute, and 6 violins.
Why 6 violins?
He admits he had absolutely no idea. It just sounded like a professional number of violins to have. 6 violins, please.
So he writes out all the music, or at least what he assumes is the music. He shows up to the very first rehearsal. The professional orchestra is sitting there. They raise their instruments, they start playing, and what happens?
Complete disaster. He describes the sound as being like a train crashing in a restaurant, just pure, unadulterated clattering noise.
Because he made a critical mistake in the rhythm.
Yeah, he messed up the actual notation. He put the emphasis on the completely wrong beat for the entire ensemble. But this is where we see that famous poker face in action again. A normal person in that situation would crumble, admit they had lied about knowing how to arrange, and get fired on the spot.
But what does Matti do?
He stops the orchestra, he glares directly at the professional bassist, and he says, you did it wrong.
The sheer audacity of that, blaming the poor session bassist.
It is kind of brilliant in a sociopathic way. He asks the bassist for the sheet music back, pretends to carefully check it over, and then quickly rewrites the notes with his pencil to fix his own mistake. He hands it back to the guy and says, now play it exactly like I wrote it.
And it actually worked.
It worked perfectly. He says from that exact moment on, he understood how to arrange. But it shows you exactly how his mind operates. He learns by walking through the fire, he commits to an impossible task, and then his brain is forced to figure out the complex mechanics on the fly just to survive.
And that perfectly sets up how we talk about his actual music. We've called him the architect of sound because he constantly builds these musical structures that logically shouldn't stand up. They do.
We definitely have to talk about the song Eliezer Ben Yehuda.
Oh, this is a total masterclass in composition. So the lyrics of this song are about the historical figure who essentially revived the Hebrew language for modern youth. But the text itself wasn't written to be a pop song. It was written essentially as a dry biography.
Right. It's incredibly dense. It's wordy. It reads like you're trying to sing a dictionary entry.
People in the industry explicitly told him it was uncomposable. You simply cannot attach a catchy melody to a history textbook.
But for Matti, challenge accepted. Exact. Caspi looked at that chaotic, highly obsessive text, and he realized that the music had to match the specific personality of the subject. Ben Yehuda was a fanatic. He was constantly running around trying to invent new words. So Caspi wrote this incredibly frantic, driving, highly complex, rhythmic structure that perfectly mimics the nervous energy of the man.
And the way he sings it, too, the source material specifically meant trembling quality.
That really is the Caspi signature. He doesn't act out the song like a theater performer. He doesn't put on a fake, emotive, show tune voice. He sings with this deeply raw, vibrating internal tension. Yeah. It often sounds like he is desperately holding back a scream or maybe a sob.
Which links right back to that architecture of silence we talked about. He is rigidly controlling the outward emotion, but the music itself is leaking it all out.
And honestly, nowhere is that emotional leak more profound than in his legendary relationship with Ehud Manor.
Creative.
Brit Olam, the Covenant of Blood, that is what they actually...
Ehud Manor was the lyricist. Matti was the composer. But it wasn't a standard music industry partnership where they just emailed files back and forth. Caspi claims it was borderline telepathic.
Literally telepathic. There's a famous story in the sources about the song Lo Chalamti Shetelki Mimeni, which means I didn't dream you'd leave. Caspi is in the recording studio. The orchestra has already recorded their parts. The instrumental track is totally done, but there are no words yet.
He is standing there ready to record the final vocal, but he has absolutely nothing to sing.
He calls Manor in a panic, and it turns out Manor had simply forgotten to write the lyrics.
That is a studio nightmare.
So Manor rushes across town to the studio. He sits down in the lobby and frantically scribbles the lyrics onto a scrap piece of paper while Matti is pacing back.
And then
Manor walks in and hands him the paper, literally with the ink still wet. Caspi walks straight into the vocal booth, puts on the headphones, and the engineer hits record.
having never once read the text before.
Never laid eyes on it. He sight-read the handwritten lyrics live on the final studio. And if you listen to that recording today, it is flawless. The phrasing, the deep emotion, sounds like he has lived with those specific words in his heart.
How is that practically possible?
Caspi says that the melody he wrote communicated the exact feeling to Manor, and then Manor's resulting words communicated that exact feeling right back to him. They didn't need to sit down and discuss the deep meaning of the song. They effectively shared one brain.
It's a beautiful creative story, but it also really highlights the tragedy of his other non-musical relationship. Because while he had this totally perfect marriage of minds with his lyricist, his actual romantic life was, well, let's just call it incredibly complex.
Yeah, that is a very polite way to put it. We are definitely entering the controversy and chaos section of his life now.
The sources mention the Sof Hayom era, the End of Day album, which came out in 1981. This is widely known as his breakup album.
It intimately documents the collapse of his second marriage to a woman named Dora. And again, look at the psychological pattern here. He cannot sit down and talk to his wife about their deep marital problem. So instead, he writes an entire brilliant album about a man and a woman who are actively destroying each other. He actually admits in the interview that he had zero model for how love was supposed.
He references his kibbutz upbringing again.
Right, he says, I didn't see it at home. And it makes sense. If you aren't raised with any display of intimacy, how are you supposed to replicate it as an adult? You just fumble in the dark. You end up hurting people.
And then, amidst all this personal chaos, comes Ricky Gale.
This is the dynamite in the story. Ricky Gale is a powerhouse singer, huge rock and roll energy. Matti decides to produce her album, Merav Mikan, which means west of here.
And he actually gave her songs that he had been hoarding for himself for 15 years.
He knew they were destined for her voice, but the studio dynamic between them, he openly describes himself as
An absolute autocrat.
He told her exactly when to breathe. He told her exactly how to shape every single vowel. He aggressively stripped away all of her theatrical acting because she was a trained actress too, and he forced her to just be raw and exposed on the mic.
She is quoted in the sources calling herself a captive to his will. That sounds incredibly intense.
It was borderline obsessive, and that intense chemistry totally spilled over into the public eye. People were absolutely convinced they were having a secret affair when they performed together. He reportedly wouldn't take his eyes off.
There's that one story in the transcript where he abruptly leaves the stage right in the middle of a performance, and she says she felt completely abandoned. It sounds less like a professional collaboration and more like a deep emotional dependency.
It was a total fusion, artistically and emotionally. But that kind of fire isn't, and eventually all the personal chaos caught up. We really have to talk about the fall.
The transcript rushes through this part a bit, but the real-world implications were huge for him. The divorce from his second wife turns into this massive, very public war.
It was incredibly ugly. It wasn't just a sad breakup. It became a national media event. There were serious legal accusations of bigamy thrown around. He ended up going.
The stoic national treasure suddenly became cheap tabloid fodder.
And his reaction was to run. He fled Israel entirely. He moved to the United States. For a man whose entire artistic identity is so rooted in the nuances of the Hebrew language and culture, that exile must have been spiritually devastating.
And crucially, he was cut off from his adult children.
That is the deepest wound of all. He talks in the interview about the intense isolation of that, being a total stranger in a strange land and losing the connection to his own blood. It is essentially the kibbutz nightmare repeating itself, being formally cast out of the...
But unlike a classic Greek tragedy where it all just ends in ruin, this story actually has a twist in the third act. He eventually finds some redemption.
He does. He talks very tenderly about his current... They have been together for 30...
And he credits her with something absolute massive. He says that she is the one who finally taught him what love actually is.
She taught him how to touch and how to be touched. She essentially broke the kibbutz curse.
It is a really powerful narrative arc, from the lonely boy who was never hugged, to the rigid dictator who controlled women in the recording studio, to an older man who finally understands true part.
It took him nearly a lifetime, but he finally got there.
Before we wrap up with his final thoughts from the interview, we have to touch on one more major intersection in his life. We've talked a lot about his personal silence, but earlier we mentioned the phrase political silence, because Matti notoriously never spoke about politics.
Which, if you know anything about Israel, is a massive statement in and of itself. Everyone talks politics there. It's the national pastime.
But even though he was silent, his music often landed right smack in the middle of the country's biggest historical trauma, specifically the war.
The Yom Kippur War in 1973. This is a definitive, traumatic moment for his entire generation.
Now, we are going to talk about a few war stories from the sources here. And just as a reminder, we are simply reporting what is in the text. We aren't taking any political sides here.
Right, just looking at the cultural impact of his music. So Caspi was performing a lot with Shlomo Gronich at the time. They were this wild, highly avant-garde musico. And during the war, they were sent to perform at the front line.
And we don't mean a safe base camp. They were at the actual front line, the Golan Heights. Caspi describes performing in a literal hole in the ground for these exhausted, deeply traumatized soldiers.
And while they were in this hole, they play a very specific song called God Pities Kindergarten.
The lyrics of which are, God pities kindergarten children, but he doesn't pity the grown-up.
Just try to imagine singing those exact words to young men who have just watched their friends die in combat.
Caspi says he realized in that exact moment that the song had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just a clever piece of art anymore. It was a raw lament. It was a mirror reflecting the absolute horror back at them. He talks about the terrible meaning that the music suddenly took on.
But then on the flip side, there is the other story in the transcript, the story about the tank.
This is the story that, honestly, probably justifies his entire difficult career. He met a young soldier in a hospital down in Beersheba. The soldier was a severe burn victim.
And this soldier explicitly told Caspi that one of his songs saved his life.
Literally saved his life. The soldier was trapped inside a burning tank. He was in agony and he was giving up. He looked up at the flames and he was ready to die. And suddenly, for some reason, a specific Matti Caspi melody popped into his head. The song was When God Said for the First Time.
And just remembering that melody gave him the adrenaline to jump, it triggered something deep inside, a primal will to live, a sudden connection to something beautiful right in the middle of hell. And he found the strength to pull himself out of the hat.
It's totally chilling. It shows that even while Matti was stubbornly silent on political issues, his music was out there doing the heavy emotional lifting for the entire nation.
He provided the background soundtrack for their physical and emotional survival, even while he was privately struggling with his own.
So that brings us back to the present day, the cancer diagnosis, the impending end of the road. Roni Kuban asks him if he has any major regrets, and Matti gives a really surprising, very candid answer. He is asked if he wishes he'd been born in a bigger country.
Like the US or the UK.
And Matti just says yes.
It is a moment of brutally honest ambition. He says that if he had just 3 more zeros in the population size, meaning a much larger commercial market, he could have achieved his ultimate lifelong dream.
Which was what?
He wanted to own and conduct his very own massive symphony orchestra. He wanted to travel the globe, conducting his own complex compositions in the biggest halls in the world.
It's a bit tragic, really. He clearly feels confined, like his specific genius was just too big for the small market he happened to be born into.
He was a whale swimming in a backyard pool, and that intense isolation really played into his famous one-man band persona. He talks in the interview about his very first solo album, where he played absolutely every single instrument himself.
The visual image of him in the recording studio late at night is so vivid. He records the drum track, then he physically runs over to the bass guitar and records that, then the piano, then he sings all his own multi-layered backing vocals.
Technically, it is incredibly impressive, very do that, but emotion. It is just that lonely little boy from the Kibbutz all over it. He didn't need a band, he didn't trust a band, he was the band.
Until now, at least. Now, facing the very end, he is finally realizing that he simply cannot do it alone.
That is the ultimate final wisdom.
The interview actually ends with him playing a song. And it is a very specific, very telling choice. The song is Lo Tov Heot Adam Lovato,
which translates to, it is not good for man.
Talk about heavy irony. The man who spent 70 years aggressively pushing people away, the man who is currently checking how low he can go into his own silence, purposely chooses that specific message for his final public statement.
It is basically his confession. He is admitting that the architecture of silence was, in the end, a mistake. Or if not a mistake, it was a childhood survival strategy that he has finally, thankfully, outgrown.
He explicitly realizes that his parents, they acted by the book, but they completely missed the point of being human. They functioned, but they didn't feel.
And Matti is using his last platform to tell us, do not just function. Feel things, touch people, speak your truth.
It is a very heavy lesson, especially coming from a man who had to learn it the absolute hardest way possible.
But he did learn it. That's the takeaway. He is leaving the world entirely surrounded by the exact love he spent his whole life avoiding. And honestly, that in itself is a pretty beautiful happy.
Matti Caspi, the man behind the math, finally taking it off for us.
Justin.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive. It is definitely a lot to process, but I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something not explicitly in the interview. We talked about his regret over not having a massive global audience, right?
Yeah, the 3 more zeros.
But think about this. Would a man who required such absolute control, such complete isolation, have actually survived the grinding machinery of the American pop industry? Maybe the confinement of the Israeli market was the exact pressure cooker he needed to preserve his unique genius. If he had those 3 more zeros, maybe his art would have been diluted. Maybe the wall he built was the perfect acoustic environment for his masterpiece. Just something to think about when you listen to his records today. And you really should go listen to one of his songs today. Pay attention to that trembling voice. I guarantee you will hear something entirely different in it now.
You absolutely.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.
Take care.